Hi folks, I'm Joel Samant, a member of the SAC Skeptics, a proud co-host of this year's SkeptCal. It's now my pleasure to introduce the next presenter. Dr. Rachael Dunlop, affectionately known as Dr. Rachael, is a biomedical researcher, a science communicator, and a leader in the Australian skeptic community. She holds a PhD from Sydney University Medical School in Australia. She is a senior research fellow in the brain chemistry labs in Jackson, Wyoming. Very cool. Her current work focuses on neurodegenerative disease therapy. When she needs to get away, she straps on her camera and she heads to the nearby national parks for some nature photography. I first heard Dr. Rachael years ago as a regular on the Skeptic Zone podcast. They battled pseudoscience and refuted anti-vaccination claims. I'm absolutely thrilled she's here, and I'm looking forward to hearing her talk entitled Big Bad Pharma, the FDA, and the reasons why a new Alzheimer's drug should never have been approved. Take it away, Dr. Rachael.
Hi, am I on, Jason?
Yeah, yes, you're on.
Oh, great. Okay. Hi, everyone, and thanks for having me today. I am going to talk today about Big Bad Pharma, the FDA, and Alzheimer's disease. And this comes from my background working in neurodegenerative diseases. In particular, at the moment, my work involves running clinical trials for Alzheimer's disease. So I do have a conflict of interest statement to put up for this presentation in a moment. But I've become involved in designing drugs for neurodegenerative disease in the last 5 years. And basically, I'm not a clinician, so I'm not actually working with patients, but I'm doing discovery research. So getting samples from those patients and trying to discover new drugs, looking at their profiles of their blood and their other biological fluids from clinical trials. So let's get started. Can we skip to the slides, or are we already on the slides? We are, aren't we?
Slides are on.
All right, go. So my talk is entitled Big Bad Pharma, the FDA and Alzheimer's, but I'm subtitled it 10 Reasons Why Aduhelm Should Not Have Been Approved. Aduhelm is the drug that is designed for Alzheimer's disease that was designed by Biogen pharmaceutical company and was approved very recently. And I'm going to start off with a conflict of interest statement, as I said. Myself and my lab where I work here in Jackson, Wyoming, we have patents and patents pending on a dietary amino acid as a treatment for neurodegenerative disease. So keep that in mind as I criticize someone else's drug discovery. So I want to talk to you today about Alzheimer's and the new drug that was approved by the FDA, made by Biogen. But firstly, for a little bit of context, Alzheimer's is a growing problem. In America now, there's approximately 6 million people living with Alzheimer's disease. During the COVID-19 pandemic, interestingly, dementia and Alzheimer's deaths have increased around 16%. Now, there's not just a mortality cost, there's also a financial cost in Alzheimer's, and that in 2021, it was estimated it was costing America $355 billion. And as predicted that by 2050, this could rise to more than $1.1 trillion. So it's now estimated or calculated that Alzheimer's kills more people than breast cancer and prostate cancer combined. With an aging population, we're getting an increased amount of the population that is living with Alzheimer's and other dementias. And there's not just a cost to the patients, but there's also a cost to carers and people looking after those people with dementias and Alzheimer's. And you can put a monetary number on that amount of care, and it's estimated to be about $257 billion and around 15 billion hours. So we're talking about a huge cost in terms of economics and health for people. And so there's a desperate need for drugs to treat Alzheimer's disease. So Alzheimer's disease is a problem, like many neurodegenerative diseases, because we don't know exactly what causes it, and there is no cure for it. The work that I do in my lab here in Jackson, Wyoming, focuses primarily on amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS, which is also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. This is another neurodegenerative disease for which a very small percentage we know is caused by genes, but most of it, we just don't know what causes it. And so in designing drugs, the best way to start would be to know what causes it and target that cause. Now, you can see that illustrated beautifully in the COVID-19 pandemic, where we know it's a virus, so we can design a vaccine against the spike proteins of that virus. Therefore, we can inhibit the disease. When you don't know what you're starting with, it's really a problem. So there are generally two main hypotheses for what causes Alzheimer's disease, and there's sort of two camps that researchers sit in, and they kind of throw stuff at each other over the parapet. And that is that one is that people think it's caused by misfolded tau. And tau is a protein that is normally associated with the movement of molecules around the cell. So it helps move nutrients around, but also it helps get rid of junk inside the cell. And when this tau doesn't work anymore, it can form these sticky clumps inside the cell, and these appear as what's called neurofibrillary tangles. And the only real way and definitive way to diagnose Alzheimer's disease is really post-mortem tissue. So when people die of Alzheimer's, you can take a slice of their brain, you can use stains to look at these neuropathology markers, if you like, in the brain, one of which is these neurofibrillary tangles formed by tau. There's another one which has kind of been the more popular and probably there's been more highly studied, is the formation of these plaques outside of the cell called amyloid plaques. And these are formed from a protein called amyloid precursor protein, which normally has a function in the cell that does things that's fine, but when it gets chopped up into pieces that are 42 amino acids long, it forms these plaques. And so the problem is that these two sticky, messy, tangled up proteins, some that form inside the cell, some that form outside, they form in parts of the brain that are associated with memory, learning, reasoning, and emotion. And so when people look at brain slices from patients who have died of Alzheimer's and they see these tangles and these plaques from beta amyloid, they made the hypothesis that these might be causative. But for everybody that's in this room knows very well that correlation does not necessarily mean causation. So are these plaques actually a consequence of the disease, or are they a cause of the disease? Well, that's been a debate for a really long time. But one of the things you can do to try to determine that is to target these proteins. And if you can remove them from the brain and then you modify the disease progression or the neuropathology, that would give you a clue as to whether they're involved. The same as if you have a viral infection, you get rid of the virus, you get better, the virus probably caused it. So people have been designing drugs against beta amyloid for many, many years. Most of these drug trials have failed. In fact, Alzheimer's drug trials have around a 99% failure rate. And there hasn't been any new drugs approved by the FDA for over 18 years. So there's a huge gap in terms of pharmacotherapies, and that leaves a huge amount of people vulnerable with no hope of anything they can have to contribute towards an effective treatment. So currently there are approximately 121 unique therapies being tested in approximately 136 drug trials. So it's not like people are ignoring this field, they're throwing everything at it. Now, when you design a drug, if you want it to be used in humans eventually, you need to go through 3 phases of testing before it's deemed safe by the FDA and it can be approved for use in humans. The first thing you do is a phase 1 trial. Now, this is primarily a safety trial. It uses a small number of people. It really just looks at the tolerability and the safety of the drug that you've designed. you obviously don't want it to make your patients sicker and kill them. So you use a small number of people, you look at the safety profile of this drug, how is it tolerated, how much of it can be tolerated, what are the side effects that you observe, would people be able to tolerate this if they need to take it for decades? If your drug gets through that phase, you go into what's called a phase 2 trial. There are about 65 Alzheimer's drugs currently in these phase 2 trials. In a phase 2, you're looking for efficacy. In other words, does it work? Does it target what I want it to do? So in the case of an Alzheimer's drug, you want to reduce or slow the decline of cognition. So when people get Alzheimer's, they very slowly over a number of years, their cognitive abilities decline. And so if you can slow or stop that process, that's the main aim of most of these drug trials. So if you design a new drug for Alzheimer's, it goes through the phase 1 safety, it's tolerated, it's safe. You put it into a phase 2, you've got 20s or 10s of people at that point. If you can show that it might be effective, then you take it into a phase 3. And there's currently about 29 unique therapies in phase 3 trials right now. And in a phase 3, you're talking about hundreds or thousands of patients, and you're looking at the safety of the drug. You're always monitoring safety, by the way, all the way through this process. But now you're really looking for efficacy. Does the drug work? Now, in the case of this new drug called Aduhelm, which was developed by Biogen, they had 2 phase 3 trials running concurrently. And in those trials, they had thousands of patients, so approximately 1,600 in each. Now, interestingly, because we already have failed in terms of designing effective drugs for Alzheimer's, many of these trials right now are just reusing or repurposing drugs that are already on the market. So there's about 43% of these drugs in these trials are repurposed from other diseases. So for example, metformin, which is a drug commonly used in type 2 diabetes, that's being trialed for whether it's effective in Alzheimer's disease. But as I say, there hasn't been any FDA approved new drugs for a very long period of time. So there's a desperate search for something, anything that works. So just to reiterate, from 2002 to 2012, 99.6% of Alzheimer's disease drug trials failed. Now, this is a huge investment for pharmaceutical companies. More than 25 negative randomized controlled trials cost billions and billions of dollars. And just recently, before Biogen drug was approved, 2 other big pharmaceutical companies had failures at the phase 3 stage for their Alzheimer's drugs. One of these, now these are the same class of drugs as what Biogen designed. One of them was from Eli Lilly. It's called solanezumab, and the mAb part of these drug names indicates an antibody. So this means that you're infusing an antibody that is going to go into the brain and pull out these sticky proteins that I described to you. So it's pulling out amyloid beta from the brain. That was described as a catastrophic fail in 2018. Roche had the same class of drug, but it was a different name. It was called gantenerumab, which is also an antibody. Their trial, which ended in 2020, was called a flop. Now, as a result of all this effort from multiple independent pharmaceutical companies, some of them just said, we're done, held up their hands and said, we can't throw more money at this problem. And so they've pulled out completely from doing research into AD drugs. So one of the big problems with Alzheimer's disease, and indeed with other neurodegenerative diseases, is that there's a long latency period between when we think that you trigger the pathology and when you start to see symptoms. That's kind of a bad thing, but it's also a good thing, because in that period of time, which could be, say, 10 to 15 years, you may have an opportunity to intervene in the disease progression and either slow it or halt it altogether. But you don't have any symptoms during that period. So it's very, very difficult to know if you have disease if you don't have symptoms. So for example, this slide just shows that there's a period of time when you're healthy, you have no symptoms, and then at some point, something happens. So I mentioned that most of Alzheimer's disease is not genetically or familiarly linked, but there are genes that increase your risk. So for example, there's a gene called ApoE4, and if you have that gene, that increases your risk of getting Alzheimer's. It's also been shown that if you have that gene and you get exposed to environmental factors, for example, very small size particles from pollution, that can increase your risk of getting Alzheimer's. So at some point, you start to get the disease beginning, and you have an incubation period where these proteins that I talked about, this amyloid plaque, it starts to build up in your brain. You still don't have any symptoms until there's a certain threshold, some point beyond which you start to get symptoms. Now, at this point, it may be too late to treat the disease. And also, there could have been a trigger that started these proteins building up, but they may not be the cause. So in this model that I've got here, you can see that the factors that might have initiated the buildup of these proteins in the brain cells, they might be the cause, not necessarily the damaged proteins. So what we ideally want to be able to do when designing an Alzheimer's drug is get you before you get a serious disease. But the problem is you don't have symptoms, so how do you know? So let's have a look at this new drug, which was approved by the FDA very recently. It's marketed as Aduhelm. It's developed by Biogen. Its drug name is aducanumab, and the mab part means monoclonal antibody. So it's an antibody. That means it's infused. It's designed to slow cognitive decline in patients that have either early stage Alzheimer's disease or mild cognitive impairment. So mild cognitive impairment is a stage of cognitive decline whereby you might just start to forget people's names, or you put your keys in the freezer, for example. It doesn't usually interfere with your day-to-day life too much. But about 70% of people that have mild cognitive impairment, they will eventually revert or convert into early stage Alzheimer's. So it's an alarm bell going off, if you like. And also, the sooner you can treat people, if the disease hasn't progressed very far, the more likely you can modify the progression of the disease. If you're leaving it to too late, it's probably too late to do anything. So in the clinical trials that Biogen designed, they had people that either had mild cognitive impairment or early stage Alzheimer's disease. Now, it was shown, even though they designed this drug to slow cognitive decline, this drug also was shown that it could remove this beta amyloid sticky proteins out of the brain in a dose-dependent manner. So the more drug they gave patients, the better the drug was at removing these sticky proteins that have some role in Alzheimer's disease. So basically, they had 2 phase 3 clinical trials. They were run at the same time. They were identically designed. And what they built into their protocols that they got approved by the FDA was, well, we want to have a peek at our data at some point before we plan to finish the trials. We want to have a peek and just see what's going on, because if we can see a signal early on, we'll continue the trials. If we see nothing, we then have an out clause. We can say, okay, look, this is not working. There's no point spending more money putting patients through infusions every month. So let's have a peek. So they had a peek in March 2019, and they determined that these trials were not working. So they terminated the trials. But they kept collecting data, and they found that although one of these trials failed outright, no question, one of them, and as I said, they're identical, one showed a hint of benefit, but they only found this benefit by analysing a subset of patients within that trial that they hadn't planned to look at initially. So they conducted a secondary analysis after the fact and found a subgroup of patients who did slightly better on cognition tests. So the numbers were that there was a 22% slowing of cognitive decline in the high dose patients. But when you design clinical trials or anything you do with science in terms of statistics, you're always taught you can't massage the data after the fact to get the answer you want. That is an absolute no-no. And this is kind of what Biogen have done here. But based on the finding that they saw a little bleep in one of the trials in a subgroup of patients on the high dose of the drug, the FDA said, well, we're going to give you accelerated approval because you showed that your drug was pulling amyloid out, even though you didn't really show that it reduced cognition decline. And so now what the FDA has said is, well, we're going to give you another chance. You've got to do what is called a phase 4 trial. You've got 9 years to come back to us with data that shows this actually works like you said it would. In other words, it reduces cognitive decline. So this created a huge amount of controversy. So I'm going to summarize for you the 10 reasons why I think this drug called Aduhelm should not have been approved. And I'm going to count backwards from 10 to 1. So you've got to stay to the end if you want to know the main reason. So I've already mentioned to you, reason number 1 why I think Aduhelm should not have been approved is that the approval flogs the dead horse of the amyloid hypothesis. So I've already mentioned to you that you can remove these sticky amyloid plaques from the brain using antibody-based therapies. Lots of other pharmaceutical companies have done this. They've all failed in their trials. There's really no, and I would say that Biogen really did fail as well. It wasn't until they cherry-picked the data after the fact that they found a small difference in a high-dose group. The problem with flogging this amyloid hypothesis is so much focus and research and development money has been diverted to this that it's really moving the focus away from new lines of inquiry that could be more fruitful in terms of developing better, more efficacious and safer drugs for Alzheimer's disease. So we just keep beating this horse, this dead horse of the amyloid causes Alzheimer's disease, and we really just can't get enough good evidence that it does. We can certainly design drugs to remove it from the brain, but if that is not having a clinical effect such that it's preventing people from getting full-blown Alzheimer's, then what's the point? And this was also reiterated by one of the neurologists who was on the committee that decided or recommended to the FDA whether this drug should be approved or not. So I'm going to go into this a little bit more in a minute, but basically all the data that Biogen generated from these clinical trials, they sent to the FDA. The FDA looks at it and then they pass it to an independent committee of experts who then pore over that data. They make their own decision and conclusion, and they recommend to the FDA whether or not the drug should be approved. The committee overwhelmingly said, no, it should not be approved. There's not enough good evidence that it works. One of these members was this neurologist called Dr. Joel Perlmutter, and he reiterated what I said. He said, approval of a drug that is not effective has serious potential to impair future research into new treatments that may be effective. So this kind of reminds me a little bit of the whole Wakefield situation where because he planted that seed that the MMR vaccine might be linked to autism, so much research money and so much effort was devoted to disproving that hypothesis when we could have been spending our time and money finding ways to treat autism. So this is kind of similar to that, I think. So my number 9 reason why I don't think Aduhelm should have been approved is it was originally granted FDA approval for patients that were not even studied in the clinical trials that were run by Biogen. So in the clinical trials that Biogen ran, they looked at people with early stage Alzheimer's disease, very early in the stages. But when the FDA approved it, oddly, they approved it for unlimited use in patients with Alzheimer's. And this would encompass around 6 million patients. There was a bit of an outcry about that. And so they recently changed their recommendation to only patients with mild Alzheimer's disease. So that would encompass about 1.5 million patients. Now, this is obviously a kick in the teeth for Biogen and, it hurts their back pocket. But the problem was that when you design a clinical trial, you need to collect the evidence for the patients you have in the trial, and then the drug works for those patients only. And as one of the investigators from one of these clinical trial sites said, there's no evidence that this drug could be beneficial for any other stage of Alzheimer's. So why would you approve it for use in all stages of Alzheimer's? There just wasn't evidence for that. Those patients were not even included in the original clinical trials. So that was a really unusual thing to do. The FDA did correct that shortly after, but that was weird. So my number 8 reason for why it shouldn't have been approved. The FDA granted approval for this drug, not based on the fact that it works or that it slows cognitive decline in people with Alzheimer's. They based their approval on what's called a surrogate endpoint. And that was that the drug can remove amyloid beta from the brain. It pulls these sticky plaques out of the brain. And they said, well, they assumed that a reduction in amyloid plaque will likely result in a clinical benefit. And that was based on the fact that they saw this little bleep in this cohort of patients that were on the high dose. That's a really tenuous thing to do, in my opinion. In the category for accelerated approval, you do not have to show that the drug really works. And the FDA asserted that by saying, well, we think it probably will work, so we're going to approve it anyway. And then that means, as I said, Biogen now has to run what's called a phase 4 confirmatory trial over the next 9 years, report back to the FDA. If over that 9 years they don't show the drug works, the FDA can recall it and say, okay, it's not approved anymore. But that's a long time for patients to be taking a drug that potentially is not going to help them. And as I'll go into in a minute, it's also going to cost them a lot of money. So my 7th reason why it shouldn't have been approved is the approval sidelines other drugs that have been shown to work. They do have efficacy. So there are actually 2 other classes of drugs that the FDA has approved for the treatment of symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. These 2 classes of drugs are called NMDA receptor antagonists, and one is marketed as memantine. And then there's acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, and one is marketed as galantamine. And these have much better safety profiles. They actually have been shown to work. For example, a recent analysis of patients taking galantamine showed that virtually none of the patients that have taken it over the last 2 decades, because it's been around for that long, they didn't decline past moderate stage dementia. So almost nobody that was taking galantamine developed end stage dementia. And galantamine is safe, it's cheap, and it's easy to take. So it's marketed as Razidine and galantamine. These 2 drugs are off patent. So you can buy them as generics, they're really cheap. Galantamine, as actually out of interest, is sort of derived from a common snowdrop. And data that has been collected since they've been approved shows that at least galantamine can induce a significant reduction in the risk of developing severe dementia. So these are different types of drugs to what Biogen has made. They're cholinesterase inhibitors. They do a completely different thing in the brain, but they've been shown to at least slow progression to full-blown dementia. And they're cheap and they're easy. They're not infusion. You can get, so for example, you can get galantamine as an oral tablet, as a liquid, or as a slow release tablet. There's other potential treatments that now could be sidelined because all the focus is on this new drug. One is called oligomanate. It is a seaweed extract which was approved in China for treatment of patients with mild to moderate Alzheimer's disease. It was approved a couple of years ago. And then my lab is studying a dietary amino acid called L-serine, which we currently have in phase 2 FDA-approved trials for Alzheimer's disease and ALS. So there's other drugs around. My 6th reason for why I think Aduhelm should not have been approved is I think it gives false hope to patients. So I mentioned that, there are a couple of classes of drugs that have been approved. They don't work great. They certainly don't cure the disease. They might slow progression, but that's in early stage. So you have to get an intervention early in your disease otherwise they really probably won't have any effect. But now that this has got the FDA stamp of approval, people will think it works, of course, and why would they think any different? And patients will want it. And Biogen has already indicated that there are strong indications of very high initial interest. And of course there would be, because if you have a family member who has Alzheimer's or dementia and you're a carer for them, or even if you're not the carer, you would know this is a terrible disease for which there is no cure. So anything that can potentially help, of course, you want to grab onto. And if the drug really doesn't do anything very much, it just gives false hope to patients. So I mentioned that it's also really expensive. So my number 5 reason why it shouldn't have been approved is because it costs around $56,000 per year per patient. Now, this is just for the drug on its own, by the way. I mentioned that it has to be infused once a month. And so the costs associated with the clinical care around the infusions, also any MRIs that are needed to look for any side effects, which I'll go into in a moment, but include things like bleeding in the brain and hemorrhaging in the brain, they're not included in that cost. So you automatically, you're just accelerating the cost of administering this drug, which, well, that depends. Do the risks outweigh the benefits? Because if the risks outweigh the benefits, then maybe it's not worth the $56,000. So let's have a look at the risks. In the clinical trials that were run by Biogen, patients on the drug experienced potentially serious side effects of brain swelling and brain bleeding. And there were 2.7% in placebo had these side effects, but 35% had these side effects in the high dose cohort, which is the cohort that Biogen mentioned is the one they think it works in. 35%. So, this could be a trade-off if, the drug is going to slow cognition decline and help you not progress into full-blown Alzheimer's. But I've already told you that that is probably not going to happen. The other problem is that these side effects overlap with underlying disease progression anyway. So some of the side effects, these ones are the ones of brain swelling and brain bleeding. Some of those are asymptomatic, but some of the side effects are symptomatic. So you can get dizzy, you can get headaches, you can get hallucinations, but you can also get that in Alzheimer's disease itself. So how do you differentiate between, well, is this a drug-induced side effect or is this just the disease progression? That's a problem. As I mentioned, when people were in the clinical trials, they were getting regular MRIs because that was being used to monitor the amount of sticky protein in their brains. And in a clinical trial, obviously you have very attentive clinical care, regular clinical care. And if you're then outside of that environment and taking these drugs and you're getting these side effects, that increases the risk that you could get a serious side effect. And then I suppose you could consider the fact that it's a infusion is quite an invasive way of administering. So the risks are pretty high for something that the benefits are pretty small. So let's just talk about what happened with the committee who looked over the evidence for this drug and recommended to the FDA whether or not it should be approved. And so essentially this is a group of 11 people who have much more expertise than I do in terms of neurodegenerative diseases and drugs to treat them. They were given all the evidence, they looked it over, and 10 of them said, no, we don't recommend this should be approved. We don't think it shows enough efficacy. We think that the side effects are too great. The risk-benefit ratio is out of whack. And so 10 of them said no. The remaining one abstained, said, look, I just really can't figure it out. The FDA went and approved it anyway. And as a result, 3 members of the committee quit in protest at this approval. The thing that also kind of the committee found problematic was that the FDA and Biogen collaborated after the trials were originally terminated to further analyze the data. Now, this is an unusual situation and has been criticized as potentially compromising the FDA's objectivity. You think? Yeah. So my number 2 reason why it shouldn't have been approved, well, now some clinicians are saying they just don't want to prescribe it. And this is not the case for all clinicians. In a way, I guess I'm cherry picking here myself because there are certainly plenty of people that have heralded it as a new era in Alzheimer's disease drugs, and thank goodness, because it's been 2 decades since we've had anything. But there are others that are much more skeptical. And for example, the Cleveland Clinic and Mount Sinai's health system have said they won't prescribe it, and the Department of Veterans Affairs have said no, they won't either. But here's my number one reason why I think Aduhelm should not have been approved, and this is the most important, and it's because it probably doesn't work. So, as I've mentioned, it was designed to slow cognitive decline in early stage Alzheimer's disease or mild cognitive impairment. And the way you test that hypothesis is you run phase 3 placebo-controlled clinical trials, which Biogen did. They looked at the data. They did not find enough evidence to demonstrate that this drug slowed cognitive decline. They went back, they looked at the data again. They found a cohort of patients within the data that if they kind of did a secondary analysis, which they hadn't planned in the beginning, which statistically would invalidate what you're doing, they found a very weak signal to show there might be some benefit. And thus the FDA gave it accelerated approval, using not the fact that it slows cognitive decline, because they couldn't demonstrate that enough, that it pulls out these amyloid beta plaques. And that's problematic because we don't even think that removing amyloid plaques from the brain has any impact on cognitive decline at all. And that's been shown by plenty of other big pharmas who have done very similar trials using the same class of drugs, and their trials have failed again and again and again and again. So if we look at some of the sort of responses and reactions from some of the regulatory bodies and also some clinicians, the Veterans Affairs Pharmacy Benefits Management have said they're not going to recommend it. They're not offering this to their patients with mild cognitive impairment or Alzheimer's. Some clinicians' reactions, and I have picked the ones that are negative. You will find positive ones, and you should look for them if you're interested. But this supports my opinion, and that is that this is Dr. Mark Dallas, an associate professor in cellular neuroscience in the University of Reading in the UK, and he says, in many ways, the clinical trials undertaken do not present a clear picture that this medicine will be of tangible benefit to individuals living with dementia. Indeed, evidence indicated that approximately a third suffer adverse side effects, which we've already talked about. Professor Robert Howard, who's at the UCL Division of Psychiatry, said, I consider the approval of aducanumab represents a grave error that will have only negative impact on patients and their families and could derail the ongoing search for meaningful dementia treatments for a decade. Amazingly, the FDA have sidestepped available clinical trial outcomes data that indicate the drug probably doesn't work. These indicate there is no consistent efficacy signal in terms of slowing decline in cognition or function. And then the final word goes to Dr. Aaron Kesselheim, who he was a member of the FDA advisory committee that looked at the data and made a recommendation for approval or not. He says there's no good evidence that the drug works. And he says that, oh, hang on. Yeah, he says that. I don't know how to respond. He says there's no good evidence that the drug works. And this might be the worst approval decision that the FDA has made that I can remember. So he's not beating around the bush about that. And finally, the Institute of Clinical and Economical Review says the evidence is insufficient to conclude that the clinical benefits of aducanumab outweigh its harms, or indeed that it reduces progression of Alzheimer's disease. So in summary, my 10 reasons why I don't think Aduhelm should have been approved. Number 10 is that the approval flogs the dead horse of the amyloid cascade hypothesis. We've tested it and tested it and tested it. We've shown that, yes, you can pull amyloid out of the brains of people, but it does not alter the course of disease progression in Alzheimer's disease. The drug was originally granted approval for patients who were not even studied in the trial. So patients that had moderate to severe Alzheimer's disease were not even looked at in the trial. So there's no way you can recommend a drug for a cohort of patients that you haven't even studied. It was granted approval by the FDA for a surrogate endpoint, not for a clinical outcome. So it was, well, if you can show in scans of the brain that it's pulled out these amyloid plaques, we'll approve it, and then you've got to go and do another study to show us if it works. Number 7 is it sidelines other drugs that have shown to be efficacious. So I talked about these drugs, the acetylcholinesterase inhibitors and the NMDA receptor inhibitors, that some are off patent, so they're now available as generics. They're really cheap. They come in lots of easy ways to take them. It sidelines those. It gives false hope to patients, which I think is unethical. You know, of course, people are going to want to jump on this drug because it's FDA approved. It's got the stamp of approval. There's nothing, you know, these patients are desperate. It's a horrible disease. There's no cure. Of course, you'd want to do it. But by the fact that you give them false hope is, you know, I believe that's unethical. And then on top of that, it's really expensive. You know, the drug itself will be $56,000, but then you've got all the associated costs with clinical care and infusions and everything else. So, you know, and maybe that's worth the investment if you're going to get a good outcome, but the evidence does not support that there will be a reduction in cognitive decline. You know, the safety profile is just not great. You know, there are side effects that are virtually overlap with the progression of the disease. And so how do you tell if you're having an adverse event from the drug or whether that's just the disease? So you know, 35% of people that were in this high dose cohort had really serious side effects. And so do the risks outweigh the benefits? Yes, I think they do. And, you know, that's supported by the independent committee who oversaw the evidence to recommend whether this drug was approved or not. Well, 10 of 11 of them said no, it shouldn't be approved, and 1 abstained. I mean, that's not a real vote of confidence for the evidence to support this use of this drug. Many clinicians are saying they don't want a bar of it, but most importantly, it just probably doesn't really work. And, you know, I could be proved wrong, and the FDA is giving Biogen a chance to do that now with a 9-year phase 4 trial. But in the meantime, there's a lot of people that will be taking it that may not get any benefit and may get some terrible side effects and certainly will spend a lot of money on it. So just to reiterate, Dr. Aaron Kesselheim, who quit the committee because of this approval, he said, this might be the worst approval decision that the FDA has made that I can remember. So that's it. And this is a moose that was in my backyard the other day. If you want to find more information about my research and my photography, please visit my website at drrachael.net. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rachael. That was wonderful. Depressing, but wonderful.
Yeah, a little bit.
One of the comments that it was in the chat, which you obviously are not going to see because you're concentrating on delivering us this wonderful information, was, can we just show some videos of puppies and kittens when this is over?
Oh, I'm sorry. Was it that depressing?
No, it was super informative of some very important information that we all need to know. So I don't think there's a person watching who would have given up a minute of it. Those of you who are watching on Zoom, remember that you can submit questions over on the YouTube channel for Rachael to discuss. Those of you on YouTube are probably posting away, while the folks working in the background to make us all look good are getting up the questions that have come in on YouTube. Let me just take the host's prerogative here briefly and just ask you a couple of questions that occurred to me while I was watching your extremely interesting talk. Now, most of us folks on the street don't really have a lot of, well, we don't have any insider information on how the FDA makes its decisions. But given what you have shown us today, as well as information that we may have obtained elsewhere, it certainly seems that this is an irregular decision, to put it in the kindest terms possible. Do you have any kind of insight as to why the FDA would make this decision against such a strong opposition from its own advisors and others?
Yeah. Well, I think because there's a dearth of drugs to treat this disease, that's one of the reasons. And there's certainly has been a lot of patient advocacy, asking the FDA to please find something. People are desperate, and this is a terrible disease with no cure. There certainly has been lobbying from patient groups that to get something, anything. And one of the points that Biogen used in defending or in trying to get this accelerated approval through, and why their drug apparently is going to work versus all the other clinical trials of the same class of drugs that have outright failed, is they used a slightly higher dose of drug in the cohort where they saw that little bleep in improvement. And so their argument is, well, we think we maybe just tested we need to test that higher dose for a little bit longer with a few more people, and we might really see an effect. So the fact that there's just nothing around, that patients are desperate, that people are asking the FDA, please find something. This was just like a little glimmer of hope that I think they just went, well, let's just give it a go because we've got nothing else. That's what I think.
Yeah.
But I think it's important that I mentioned that, Biogen's doses were slightly higher than the other pharmaceutical companies. And so their argument is, well, hey, maybe we just found that sweet spot now in the dose of this class of drugs that other guys have missed. So let us have a chance to do this 9-year phase 4 and see what happens. But at the expense of, a lot of other things like patients and money and potentially side effects. And so, yeah, that's what I think.
Well, I think that is a very, very plausible possibility. You mentioned in your talk that not very many, a number of agencies like the Veterans Administration and others are saying, no, we're not going to okay this. Insurance companies, some have refused to okay it as well. Do you have any sort of feeling whether this is being prescribed? Is anybody using it?
Only from what I've seen, from what Biogen have said, they've said that I think when it initially was approved, they had a rush of orders to the value of $1.6 million, where apparently clinics were ordering it in just to stock it up in their clinics. But in terms of whether it's being prescribed, I don't know. I know people have bought it from Biogen and they've stocked it, but whether it's being prescribed and used, I don't know.
On the other hand, I don't do mental math very well, and I can't take off my shoes to count right now. But if obviously they're charging $50K a pop, and obviously a hospital buying it from Biogen is not going to be paying $50. But even if they're only paying $20,000 a pop, if they've only sold 1.5 million, that's not that many orders.
No.
So
I agree with that. Yeah. I agree with that.
Yeah, what I'm kind of fishing toward here is maybe this is good news. The fact that cooler heads, so to speak, seem to be prevailing. I don't know.
Well, Biogen executives have been on the record saying that they were upset and disappointed with the criticism their drug had received, because that has affected the amount of money they've made off it so far, essentially, is what they're saying. So they kind of wish people would stop being mean to them, because they would have sold more units if people weren't so mean. So I think that it has actually impacted their bottom line. So I guess they have considered the investment they've already made and the one they have to make for the next 9 years may eventually pay off. But yeah, I did come across a comment from a Biogen exec that said, hey, you guys, stop it, because we're not selling as many units as we would have if you didn't say mean things about our drug.
Well, as those of us who are even slightly familiar with the process of drug development and approval know, the system is Byzantine at best, and worse than that. We have a question from one of the attendants. Thomas Klein says, could you comment on the high cost of clinical trials? Do costs really have to be so enormous?
Yeah, good question. And the answer is no. where I work in Jackson, Wyoming, we conduct phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trials, and we fund them ourselves. And certainly with phase 1 and 2, we can get the cost down a lot. So we did a phase 1 for this amino acid called L-serine for ALS and AD. Just for ALS in phase 1. And we only spent $2.5 million on that, and we had 20 patients. And that is significantly lower than what Pharma would spend. They would spend 10, 15 million. And now we are now running a phase 2 for this dietary amino acid called L-serine in Alzheimer's disease and ALS. And in total, we're spending about 4 million to do those trials. So there are ways you can keep costs down. Once you get to phase 3, forget it. You're going to blow 20 million bucks. There's no question, because you have to then have multiple trial centers. You can't just run it from one hospital. So, we've got a phase 2 running right now, but it's running out of Dartmouth Hospital in Lebanon, New Hampshire exclusively. So we don't have to pay for multiple principal investigators and multiple technicians and multiple pharmacies and everything. So once you get to phase 3, forget it. You're going to blow $20 million. But certainly in phase 1 and 2, you can reduce your costs. And we've shown that at where I work here in Jackson, Wyoming. But certainly pharmaceutical companies, they're for profit. We're not a for-profit. I work for a not-for-profit. So we have to keep the costs down. So we have to find ways to save money without compromising patient ethics and patient care. But certainly Pharma just seem to, they're for-profit companies. They have the money to do it. I don't think it has to cost that much is my answer.
And the corollary of that, I suspect, is that the drugs themselves don't have to cost as much either. Another question from Gail Knapp. If there is a finding after the fact, I certainly understand why that should not lead to approval. But could it be the evidence that there is a potential for future testing?
Absolutely. And that's normally how you would generate new hypotheses, is if your clinical trial failed, you definitely would go back and look at your data and dig through everything and formulate new hypotheses, and then you would start again. Unfortunately, you'd have to start again. So, I'm not a biostatistician, but biostatisticians have been extremely critical of the way this has been massaged, if you like, because when it comes to stats, I'm told, and I'm not a statistician, as I say, but you design the experiments from the beginning, you work out how you're going to analyze them, and then you do that. And if it doesn't work, certainly go back to the data, dig around, formulate new hypotheses, go, hey, there's a little bleep in this data here in this higher cohort group. We have to do another trial. But massaging the data and sort of cherry picking the data, which is what this sort of amounts to, is certainly not acceptable amongst biostatisticians. But certainly it would generate a new hypothesis that you could then genuinely run a new trial and test. But, all of that takes more time and more money and more patients. And part of the problem right now in clinical trials, everywhere you go, you'll find that it's really hard to recruit patients right now because COVID is just making it extremely difficult. We've had a trial now running for 4 years, which should have taken 3. It's still going because hospitals have other stuff on their minds, understandably, and we can't transport patients around the country like we used to be able to. And so there's a whole lot of stuff that slows that down. And so recruiting patients at the moment is a huge problem. So, if a trial would normally take 4, right now it'll probably take 6 or 7. So yeah, absolutely, you can generate new hypotheses from the data you collect, but you're not supposed to just massage it and use it.
You're not supposed to make it an ad hoc hypothesis.
No, you're not supposed to post hoc it.
Yes. Rob Palmer asks, is it surprising that Alzheimer's deaths were increased 16% by the pandemic? Why would this be?
Yeah, I've thought about that.
Sorry, I stopped reading too quickly. As Alzheimer's is a geriatric disease and COVID hits, we just lost. Go back. I didn't finish reading that, gang. Alzheimer's is a geriatric disease and COVID kills higher percentage of the same population. Wouldn't the cause of death for many in that population in this time be COVID instead of Alzheimer's, which they would have died from instead of later on? So the relationship, I think, is between being elderly and being more susceptible to COVID, to Alzheimer's, clearly, but also being more successful. That. Do you know what I'm trying to say? Thank you. Easy for you to say. Are you taking septuagenarian ladies who are worried about Alzheimer's? Sorry about that. Anyway, Robbie asks a serious question.
Yeah, look, I don't know, but I did think about that because when I looked at that statistic, I thought that was interesting. And I wonder if it's something to do with care and the level of care that people have not been able to receive during the COVID pandemic. So perhaps if the patient had a carer coming, twice a day, now they could only come once a week because of, limits on PPE or exposing the person to COVID, or just the fact that they can no longer travel across. I don't know. So I don't know the answer to that, but I would think that might be a contributing factor, is that carers just couldn't be as attentive because they physically couldn't attend. I mean, you can imagine if you have an aged person who has Alzheimer's, you certainly don't want to bring COVID into their environment and kill them from COVID, right? So maybe you're just not seeing them as much, and without as much close care, that could result in their decline. But I do not know the answer to that, but it's a really interesting point. And I did think that myself when I saw that statistic. I thought, wonder why that is.
Yeah, and there could be an interaction effect as well. I mean, we really don't know. In addition to the kind of the environmental effects that you're talking about of reduced care and so forth. David Allman Smith has a question. Have you an opinion that degradation of the blood and brain, I think he means brain, not braid, barrier. You might wear braids, but I don't think that's what he's talking about. The degradation of the blood-brain barrier is antecedent to plaque buildup.
What was the last part of the question?
What's the relationship of the blood-brain barrier to plaque buildup?
Oh, I don't know. Okay. Yeah, I don't know if there's a relationship between that.
Okay.
Not that I'm aware of. There may be, but I'm not.
Science is
not
full of unanswered questions, right?
Yeah.
Gail Knapp asks, many of the vaccine-hesitant COVID people are saying that the reason the vaccine was approved are exactly the arguments you were saying for this drug. Does this mean that the FDA is losing credibility?
Well, I don't think there's the evidence. There's certainly not the lack of evidence around the COVID vaccines that there is for this drug in terms of efficacy, for example. It's the opposite, really. There's the evidence for efficacy of the COVID vaccines is overwhelming. Does that mean the FDA is losing respect? Maybe, but I don't know if that's on in the general population or not. But I certainly think this is they've taken a hit with this particular drug, and maybe they'll be proven right. Maybe in 9 years' time, Biogen will come out with a new set of data and say, "Hey, you guys, you were all wrong," and we'll have to, eat our hats, and that's fine. But I think their role should be to be cautious. But that's kind of the conundrum with this disease, isn't it? That as I said, there's been nothing for 2 decades. People are desperate. They need something. And this is what they decided to do. So yeah, I guess it's your personal opinion whether you think that's their reputation's taken a hit. Yeah.
Well, it may be unrelated. I mean, for the COVID vaccine hesitant or opponents, pretty much anything the FDA is going to do is going to come under fire anyway. David Parks has a question. Does having a marginally approved treatment complicate and raise costs for testing new treatments, since the control patients may have to be taking the approved treatment as the baseline?
Yeah, good point. I don't know if they'd have to take this, though. But, I mean, for example, it's a good point. I don't know, because I have seen comparison clinical trials looking at new drugs versus memantine, for example, which I mentioned is an NMDA receptor antagonist and has been around for decades. So yes, usually when you run a clinical trial, you compare the new drug to the gold standard of what's currently being used. So I would expect that that wouldn't happen until this gets full approval, which won't be for at least 9 years, because as I mentioned, this is an accelerated approval, which is not a full approval. It's kind of like emergency authorization, I suppose, like COVID vaccines were. So I would expect it wouldn't be compared to new treatments until this phase 4 trial is finished in at least 9 years' time. So I don't think we'd have to worry about it right now. But it's a good point, because yes, mostly clinical trials are run comparing the current treatment versus the new one to see if it's better or how it compares. That's right.
Well, we are coming to the close of our period together, Dr. Rachael. Thank you so much for joining SkeptCal. This has been a real pleasure and very enjoyable, regardless of the possibly depressing aspects of your talk. But we all need to know this, and this is very important. So for participants, for listeners, there's an exhibitor spotlight that's going to take place now. We'll have some more of our exhibitors describing themselves to you. This is going to be followed by invitations to you to go to our exhibitor rooms. After that, at 3:30, the next speaker, Thomas Westbrook, will be occupying the stage. So take a little time to visit our exhibitors and learn more about other skeptics organizations, skeptically related podcasts, and the like. Dr. Rachael, thank you again for being here with us in 2021 SkeptCal.
Thank you, Eugenie. Lovely to see you.
Lovely to see you too. Take care.